Well, welcome to C.S. Lewis College seminar on Immanuel Kant's essay, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? This essay was written in 1784 in the heart of the Enlightenment period, and Kant is understood as the quintessential Enlightenment philosopher. So early in the essay, he starts using the word, in our translation, minority or immaturity. Let's talk about that word. What do you think that means in the context of this essay?
You can't do it alone.
Okay. If you are a minority or immature, you can't do it alone. Is that what you mean?
Right.
Okay. That's part of what he means, yes.
I think that to me it means he's saying that you're making yourself less of your own choosing.
Okay, so if you choose to remain person who is immature, or as our translation puts it, minority, then you're choosing to be less than what you could be. Okay? Somebody else? Anybody else? What do you think he means by this? This dominates the essay in some respects, but it's certainly important at the beginning.
I think the way I interpret it was that without enlightenment, we're less than who we were meant to be, and that by achieving or growing in enlightenment, we fulfill our greater call.
That's good. We're on track now. So to whom are we beholding as part of the minority or the immature? Who is it that's over us according to Kant? Who is he most concerned about?
State.
Pardon?
The state.
Partly, only partly though, because later on, doesn't he praise Frederick the Great?
Yes.
So it's not completely the state that's his problem. Who is keeping us immature? Who is keeping us this immature, undeveloped person?
He mentions religion several times.
Yes. Now we're getting closer to the reality. So what do you think he means by that?
It's oppressive.
That a religion by definition is oppressive. Did you catch that? This is what he's saying. Middle of the 18th century, 1784, religion. And what religion in particular is he talking about? He lives in Northern Europe, in Königsberg, a little tiny community in East Prussia, under the rule of Frederick the Great. Just what religion is he talking about?
Is that Roman Catholic or Lutheran?
Lutheran.
It's Lutheran Christianity, okay? Lutheran Christianity. His parents were pietists. His parents raised him in the church. Pietism was a movement within Lutheranism that sought to bring into Lutheranism a deeper sense of not just piety, but the emotion of realizing that only in Christ do we find grace. And actually, Kant rebelled against that his entire life. So the oppressor here is Christianity.
Was he a pastor's kid by chance?
No, he wasn't, but it fits some other patterns that you know about, doesn't it? Like Nietzsche, whose father was a pastor. So if you're familiar with Paul Witz's work on modern atheism, he links modern atheism to absent fathers and people whose relationship to their fathers are shattered or broken. So for Kant, the oppressor here is Christianity in particular. Now, this is the middle of the actual historical period we call the Enlightenment. So that period of the 1700s, the Enlightenment starts with the French Enlightenment, people like Rousseau, Montesquieu, so forth, Voltaire, those people, Diderot. So that's where modern atheism began, and that's where the Enlightenment began as well. And Kant, although he never left the little town of Königsberg, kept apprised of those developments very closely. So that's the first thing about the beginning of this idea of immaturity. But what does he mean then, given that, by tied to this, by this concept of the way of thinking or manner of thinking? What does immaturity cause us to do?
Follow false leaders, not think for ourselves, not think deeply.
Not think for ourselves, not thinking at all, maybe? Follow leaders that might lead us astray? What else? A way of thinking tied to immaturity.
I think it causes us to seek outside leadership. I don't know if that's the same thing, but that's what he's talking about several times, is putting ourselves willingly under guardianship of other people.
Okay, so we feel insecure about our thinking, so we want someone else to do our thinking for us in some ways. That is kind of what you mean? What else? What do you think he means by this manner of thinking? This is found again in that first couple of paragraphs, that there is a manner of thinking that, or a way of thinking that goes along with this immaturity.
Well, on page 2, he puts in the words of puts in the mouth of the clergyman, do not argue but believe.
So, now, what do we make of that? So who is doing our thinking for us, according to Kant? The clergy. The clergy.
Well, broader, so that I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, etc.
So it's more than just the clergy then. So I go to my
Let the
doctor.
experts tell us what to do.
Experts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Authority.
Authorities. Okay. So this minority status, this immature status, and he doesn't mean minority here in any kind of racial sense or ethnic sense, but this immature status is enhanced or guided or directed by authorities of one kind or another. Doctors, clergy, who else?
Well, he says a book, and that would reference the Bible as putting it down.
The Bible,
Yeah.
indeed. In fact, that book in particular, that would be important. Okay? What else?
You mentioned rules and formulas. So
Okay.
there's a traditional system of thought, a mere tradition of the way of thinking about something. People are going to submit to it because that's the way of doing it. It's the simple
Wait.
formula.
The way we've always done it, right? Rules of
Rule of thumb.
thumb.
Yeah.
Rules of thumb. Or what Benjamin Franklin would have called
Common sense?
common sense. Huh?
Yeah.
So that also keeps us immature. Why? Why would those things keep us immature? Why would those rules of thumb keep us immature?
They're fallbacks.
Fallbacks?
We're not exercising our own understanding, we're still relying on the guidance of another.
Somebody else is telling us. Somebody even we don't know. So we just always did it this way.
But now I'm relying on Kant telling me that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Interesting, isn't it?
Excellent.
Okay. So, are you suggesting he's presuming himself to be an authority here?
All I know is the first lesson I had in Philosophy 101 is to distrust authority. And I swallowed that hook, line, and sinker. And it turned out the only reason I swallowed that was because I took the person telling me, a professor, to be an authority.
Ah, yes.
Straight into that and swallow a camel.
Yeah. Because as he is may be alluding to is actually, I don't know whether he intends to or not, but he's trying to, Augustine said all search for truth begins with the acceptance of some authority.
Yes.
And so he's trying to get around that.
Oh, absolutely. So Anselm put it this way, faith seeking understanding. And Anselm got that from Augustine.
Right.
Faith seeking understanding. So it's in the Augustine tradition, all knowledge begins with faith assumptions. All knowledge.
Right. Who is, and actually Augustine is alluding to Isaiah,
Yes.
unless you or establish you shall not understand unless you.
Isaiah chapter 7, look it up. There it is. Okay. So, how many of you have ever studied geometry? What was the first page of that geometry text like?
The postulates, and if you disagree with any of them, you can't prove the theorems. Or you get some non-Euclidean geometry that looks strange.
But even non-Euclidean geometry begins with
Postulates.
postulates, just
Yeah.
different ones,
Right.
right? Okay, so you see now the conundrum we find ourselves in at this point.
Did Kant ever recognize that problem? I mean, to me, it's from what little I remember of his philosophy, it's in the woof and warp of his philosophy. He completely ignores the fact that he falls for the thing he's against.
That's a great question.
I mean, did he ever bump up against that wall and realize, oh, or not?
He slides up against it a couple of places. He believes autonomous reason, and autonomous means what? What does that word mean?
Doing on our own.
By itself, yeah.
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 A law unto oneself. Autonomous. A law unto oneself. Autonomous reason was the basis for all things. Ethics, social engagement, politics, philosophy, knowledge of the world, autonomous reason. But he says that there are three ideas that autonomous reason cannot prove. One is that I have a self, that I am a self. I can't prove that. In fact, in Kant's thinking, myself is, well, you've done this. Have you ever thought of yourself thinking about yourself, thinking about yourself? Have you ever done that? Have you thought about yourself thinking about, did I think about that? Yes, I thought about, yeah. But you never get to yourself. You're always the I thinking about yourself. So you never get to yourself. He said, I just have to assume there's a self there. I can't know the self. I have to assume the self is there. The second is the world. The world. So do we really know there's a world out there?
I would say there's two types of worlds.
Yes.
One that we know and one that we can't know. So I think it's the phenomenal new needle split there.
So the one we can know is the one shaped by the structure of our minds. The one we can't know, he calls it the thing in itself, that we can never know at all. And that's the Matrix. If you've seen the movie, that's the Matrix. Are we in the bubble? Are we out of the bubble? Have we taken the red pill or not? That's the question.
Or are we a brain in a vat?
Yes, exactly. And the third thing he's not sure about is God. But he knows that his system cannot hold together without assuming God, because his ethics depends on God sorting out the relationship between happiness and goodness at death. But those are where he slides up to this thought that maybe I need some assumptions, but those are the only places where he slides up to it.
Well, in his words, he kind of sets aside a scholar as having the independence to think on his own.
Yes.
He defines it as the scholar has complete freedom.
Complete freedom. Autonomous. Complete freedom. And the other? Who's the other person?
I didn't read that part.
Okay, all right, that's okay. But there's another part. So he takes the example of a clergyman. So the clergy are the oppressors, or potentially so. So what do you do if you're a thinking clergyman, a scholar? And by the way, in his time, remember, Lutheranism was state religion, and the education of clergy was handled by the state in the university system, as it is today, still in Germany. And so you would have gotten a first-rate education, actually paid for by Frederick the Great, okay? And so you would have been trained as a scholar, but then you have to enter the pulpit every Sunday morning, right? So what does he say about that kind of person? What kind of dilemma does that person face?
You seem to say you're bound by the oath you took to be a pastor or a preacher, and you're bound to the teachings of the church as a pastor.
Okay?
But he actually says you should also be a scholar, and when you are not speaking in that official capacity, you should explore those things and write about those things, and you should be free to question and examine those things.
So the scholar he calls to be absolutely free, autonomous, unshackled by any oath of loyalty to creed that might shape that community of faith. But as a clergyman, being a clergyman in that role, you're bound by that. So this is what's meant in the note public and private form of this.
I think there's a choice in there though, because no one's just born a clergy. You choose that. So when I think of that, I think of, one is bound by the walls of the house that they choose for themselves, but don't forget that you chose to move into that house. So don't forget the essence of yourself as a scholar, as a thinker. But if you're going to inhabit that home, you abide by the rules of those walls.
Okay?
I'm not sure at that time, though, that it was so much a choice. It was the way they became educated. It was something pretty well defined.
What do you mean? They weren't all clergymen?
No, but the clergy, you described it as being a choice to be the clergy. And the clergy was, in many cases, the way that someone became educated. And the evolution of education in Europe actually was very much that way. It was decided by the parents what education you were going to get. And based on that education, that's what you became. And because of that very defined role, you couldn't then later become something else because you weren't prepared to be something else. So the freedom to choose to be a clergyman at this point was not necessarily the individual's choice. And Kant describes, I think, the option that person now has is to say, I am reflecting to you what the church is saying. And then in a different audience, he can say what he or she thinks. But when he's in the role of the clergy, Kant says he has to say, this is what, to use his words, he will say, our church teaches this or that. So in that role, that person is now reflecting the church. But it doesn't prevent him from, according to Kant, having another identity as a scholar, where he may have the opportunity to express his own feelings that he has developed as his independent thinking.
That was a good history lesson. It does sound like a world of imposters, though.
So which of these two roles do you think Kant believes is the most authentic?
The true one.
The scholar.
The scholar.
The scholar is being set up as the ultimate guardian, the person in authority who is doing this free thinking and letting maybe the common man or other people who are studying what is really the truth.
So this even includes, and the reference here is also in the one of the translations, the translator translated as creed. The other, another translation translates it as symbol of what lies at the center of their role as clergy. So what do we make of that? How do we understand that? To what is he referring, do you think?
Well, it may actually go back to something even earlier, which was the translation of the Bible into the Vulgate, which for the first time made it possible for individuals to actually read the Bible. And so that may have been the beginning of Enlightenment, the point at which individuals were being exposed to the Word of God without it being filtered through the church.
Well, in Kant's day, it would have been Luther's translation of the Hebrew and the Greek into German, and that translation formed German as a literary language. So that would have been the Bible that Kant would have known. It would have been the German translation. But what does he mean by the word symbol or creed here?
I mean catechism or confession.
Okay.
He references the Dutch Calvinists, and so I'm thinking he's thinking the Westminster Confession or something like that, where congregants are sort of bound by the confession.
Yeah, there's a translation here on page 4 of the one that I asked you to download if you classes. It's his Germanic treatment of a Dutch word that could be translated best presbytery. Okay, presbytery. And so that's kind of the context in part, but it's also referring to what's at the heart of that catechism. What is the heart of that?
The distillation of our beliefs, that's what symbol used to mean.
Okay,
It's not just representing something else, it is the heart of what it is.
okay,
So the Bible is wine, the creed is brandy, and the creed is the symbol of our religion.
okay. So that's the kind of thing he's talking about here. So now, does this private-public thing relate to that as well, or not? In other words, is it possible for the clergy to abandon that creed in their public scholarly work, but in their work as a clergy to affirm it?
Right, so a clergyman is connected to do his catechism, students, and his community after the church he serves, his presentation symbol, for he's been accepting to that condition, but as a scholar, he has complete freedom. Is that getting closer to what you're
Yes. So again, affirming this ideal of the complete freedom of the scholar. The complete freedom of the scholar. So this is the kind of analysis so far that Kant gives us of this. So how does this tie to enlightenment? Why do you think he takes this tack to try to answer the question, what is enlightenment? It's the buzzword of the day, by the way.
Could he be maybe looking toward what we now call scientific method? Like nowadays, we just take it for granted that, you come up with a hypothesis, you test it, some part of it was wrong, no need to get offended. Now it's time to tweak your hypothesis and, slowly learn more and more about whatever field you're researching in. And if we have to deal within the confines of religion or the state or whatever, where an experiment showing our hypothesis to be wrong would put us outside of orthodoxy or get us in trouble with the state. You know what I'm saying? Like perhaps he's trying to look for, at least in the realm of scholarship, we have freedom to take a little bit of step out there and to learn where what we thought was true, the rules of thumb, and what we grew up being told doesn't necessarily apply or is no longer the case, or just never was right. We just assumed that all horses have so many teeth. Is he kind of maybe pushing in that direction without the language that we now have today?
Yeah, you're right on track. Kant was deeply affected by the work of Isaac Newton. And so the Principia was published in 1688. And it was, Kant was able to read it, and he saw it as the central piece of kind of scientific work that had been needed. It combined mathematics and experimentation in a groundbreaking new way. And it presented a view of the cosmos that was brand new, modern. In fact, it was, in some respects, the trigger for what we call the Enlightenment period. The world is understandable on the basis of mathematical and mechanistic laws. We call the concept of the law of nature gets reduced to just those things that relate to how physical things operate in the cosmos as we can see, touch, feel it, and know it. So part of Kant's work, philosophically, is trying to preserve Isaac Newton's vision of science that was under assault by a man named David Hume, who died in 1776, whose work on human knowledge in the 1740s, Kant said, awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. Because Hume's system of empiricism leads to skepticism about our ability to know anything, not even cause and effect. So if we can't know cause and effect, then Isaac Newton's whole vision is, well, in real trouble. And so Kant's philosophical work is designed to provide a philosophical foundation for Isaac Newton. So in that world, this is a closed universe of cause and effect. It's a material universe. And for Isaac Newton, God is a deistic God who creates the machine, he winds up the machine like a vast clock, and it works. And where God gets involved is only those places where the calculus fails. So where Isaac Newton couldn't figure something out, God steps in. That's where the phrase God of the gaps comes from. God only comes into the gaps of our knowledge, but the more knowledge we have, there are fewer places for God to intrude into human affairs. So Kant is very much part of that understanding of the cosmos. So when he gets to the idea of the nature of the use of reason, or how we think about reason here, he is very much referencing in that word a systematic, what we would call a scientific methodological approach to how reason works, that he learned by reading Isaac Newton.
So it's more like engineering then. Like when you come up with a robot or a product, it's not perfect. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Maybe that's Hume's problem. He wants a perfect robot the first time. But Kant's more like, no, we need a beta version. And then when we find out what's wrong with it, we don't put God in the gaps, we re-engineer it.
We re-engineer
And we
it.
need the freedom to re-engineer our whole mode of thinking and methods of thinking.
Hume had some other problems besides that, because he really did struggle with saying that we only know by reason, by sense experience alone. And when you look at sense experience alone, you can't actually prove cause and effect.
It seems to me that
And you can't even prove your logical thinking.
No, you can't. That's the problem.
it seems to me that Kant overall is trying to encourage his audience. Think for yourself. Use the skills that you have, the intellect that you have, the experience that you have. And he's kind of fighting against the notion that there's nothing new under the sun. He says, one age cannot bind itself and conspire to put the following one into a condition that it would be impossible for it to enlarge its cognitions and to purify them of errors, and generally to make further progress in enlightenment. So to me, it just says move forward, build on the shoulders of what has been established, and then improve upon it.
And that goes back to the whole concept of progress. Is
Yes.
progress possible, which C.S. Lewis addressed later on.
So what do you think Kant's view of progress is?
I think it's just inspiration having space to take action.
Okay. Is it inevitable? Is it, how does it work?
Well, I think that, the developments in science, practical things like printing, gunpowder, there were a lot of ferment that suggested progress was possible in Kant's time.
When you say it's free, I think he called it self-incurred tutelage, that men were lazy and they just simply took for gospel what those in power said was the right and the good, and back then the kings or the monarchs would deprive the people of the proper education. So I would guess Kant would say true freedom would be breaking off those shackles of tutelage and figuring things out for yourself rather than
Totally for yourself. So laying aside all traditions, rules of thumb, ways of doing things, all the kinds of assumptions that previous generations had made about the nature of life, and using reason alone, autonomous reason alone, to determine the next course of action.
it's more of a deontological look than, I guess, wait and see the consequences if we're going to bring him back into the way.
Well, it would be, he would say that he could reach by reason a rule, a categorical imperative that would govern our ethics, and that would be derived by reason. We could employ our reason, mathematical and sense experience together, as Isaac Newton did, to determine the shape of science. And for Kant, this progress then would be inevitable. We would always get better and better and better. So this sets the stage for what in the 20th century is called the Enlightenment Project. The assumption up until World War I that this progress is inevitable. That assumption dies in the trenches of World War I. But that progress is inevitable. All we need to do is use our reason, experiment, try new things. We'll get better and better and better.
Could that be related to the fact that he rarely left his hometown? He never got out to see the world, and because Germany, I assume at that time was a little bit like parts of Germany today, where things are made to work like clockwork and they look nice and orderly. And
He was very orderly. They said of Kant that the ladies of Königsberg could set their watches or their clocks by the regularity of his walks.
So background assumption then is he's assuming the rest of humanity is tracking with the humanity he's lived around, the environment he's been in, and that little assumption was exploded literally in World War I.
That is the tragedy of World War I. In many respects, that we see in not rationality at work, but irrationality at work. So Europe after World War I experiences a nihilism. And nothingism means there are no values, there are no truths, there is no progress. And so we just muddle along. Max Weber in 1917 celebrated the disenchantment of the world. There is no God, there is no transcendence. We just have to apply the best science we have and just keep going. That's all there is to it.
But isn't that a consequence of, back with Newton, you said his God was a deistic God.
Yes.
So the God of the gaps was not the true God, and the God we were assuming throughout this Enlightenment period who will fill the gaps, well, that God turns out not to be there when there's a big old gap called World War I. So in a way, they're right to say there is no God if that's the God they need.
And Nietzsche captures that before World War I, when he says we have killed God in his wonderful little parable about the madman. And so there's no God, and we're the ones who murdered him.
You mentioned the categorical imperative, though. Isn't that an assumption? It is not something that can reasonably be proved. You could start with different
Yes.
assumptions and from reason then conclude and get totally different world, a totally different situation.
That's the tricky part of it. Kant works very hard to try to establish the categorical imperative as universal and logical and rational and applicable to all situations and all people in all times, regardless of any circumstance. Which seems a little bit counter to the idea that we lay aside everything in the past. But he also lays aside virtue. He also lays aside the notion that we can be mentored into a deeper understanding of truth by anybody. And he even says that autonomous reason must decide whether the Holy One is the Holy One of God, referring to Jesus. So it's a matter of reason alone that makes that decision.
He has great faith in reason.
He does.
And that's where I think it fails, because reason, as I believe with Augustine, that reason always has to be subject to faith. That any logical, if you go back to Aristotle, any logical sequence demands preconceptions. If you have no preconceptions, you can't do logical thought.
So this raises a really good question. So what do we do with this in the 21st century? Gathered here at a C.S. Lewis conference, exploring faith and exploring goodness, truth, and beauty. Reading Lewis, who said reason is the organ of truth and imagination is the organ of meaning. How do we put reason into a proper place related to faith or assumptions or our experience of the world outside of our own autonomous reason? How do we begin to do that?
Well, God created logic, and He intended for us to use it to fulfill His wishes.
Okay, so logic or reason has to be directed in some way?
We should, it can be used for good or for ill. It's a tool, and we should try to use it for good because we should seek God's guidance.
Okay. So then how do we come to know what the good is?
For the Bible tells me so.
Would it be those things that kind of like a social contract idea, that it's those things that the good is, or those things that should I lead to a better society? That's very generic. That kind of belong to the categorical imperative. Only do those things that you'd be okay with becoming the law. So we all have kind of this knowledge of what the good is.
So we agree that ourselves, or is this based on something else?
No, that rang a bell from a poli-sci class I had. It was something about, no, I felt what you were thinking. It was, I could be wrong, but it's this idea of if you're going to live in this nation state, we all come to agreement on what it is we're loyal to. If that's faith to this, if that's faith to that, then whatever it is, that's what guides our reason as a community under a border or whatever.
But do we do that ourselves, or is that based on something else beyond just our agreement with one another?
Everything that anybody said about this comes back to the word faith. Which is very interesting.
But you have to have faith to get out of bed. I mean, you have to believe in the laws of gravity and there's an ordered world. There's no reason other than our faith that we should believe that that the monster's not going to come out of the.
I have faith that I'm seeing your shirt and that it's blue. How
Right.
do I know it's blue?
Well,
You
actually,
don't.
it's a check. I I'm sorry to have to disagree with that. That is clearly a check, sure.
Now, one technique popularized by Greg Benson is to check out where everybody has a worldview. To check out the validity of worldviews is to assume that different worldviews are true, and then show that they lead to madness if they assume the antithesis.
If they're contradictory?
Right.
Yeah, okay. The flip side of that is called argument to the best explanation.
Yes.
Which says we pull together all of our human experience, not just our own personal human experience, but we avoid what Lewis called the fallacy of chronological snobbery. Exactly. And that we draw from the entire history of human life as we know it, and we try to figure out what is it that leads to the most flourishing kind of life, and what gives the best explanation for that flourishing kind of life.
But who determines that? The best flourishing type of life, my definition of flourishing is going to be completely different than your definition. So who defines that term that you're working towards?
Good
Like
question.
that doesn't,
And look at-
huh?
The power, whoever
Yeah.
rules power defines it for you.
Yeah.
And that's what postmodernism says. It's all reducible to power.
Is it though? Because there were some nation states where it wasn't survival of the fittest. You had this idea of a noble savage, and it was, there's different ways to look at it. It just depends on which faith you want to look through.
So how do we make that judgment? We're very close to Romans 1, if you're thinking about this. What does Paul say what does St. Paul say in Romans 1?
Seems to be a common knowledge among cultures and civilizations. If you look at the best in each one, you might
For
see.
the invisible things of him from the creation of the world, clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead.
Sort of. I lean more towards a natural law, more than a specific knowledge of the deity. More of his, I guess, more towards the character, the attributes of God, more than the knowledge of God himself. But nevertheless, you sort of see that in each. You go to the best of each philosopher in each society. I think that's what Lewis was sort of drawing on when he wrote The Abolition of Man.
So how does Lewis start the Mere Christianity?
Similar.
So and this is a good segue to this afternoon. So we'll do Lewis this afternoon, but how does Mere Christianity begin?
The moral argument, right?
Yeah. So no matter where you go in the world, there is a sense of right and wrong. There are some things that every culture for all time has said were wrong or evil.
Imagine every culture had some version, every religion has had some version of the golden rule.
So everyone.
Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, they've all got some ideal of the golden rule, which is boils down to treat others as
You would like
greatest
to
commandment, right?
Yes. So that seems to be pretty universal, Lewis is arguing in the beginning pages of Mere Christianity. And that's kind of how he starts this journey of, well, how do we make that decision? And the argument is, at the end of Abolition of Man, the catalog of moral positions from around the world is a further evidence of Lewis's work in this area, that he examined all the cultures of the world, on all the world religions, as we learned this morning. Joy did as well, and they held that in common. They had done serious work on world religions, and it came to see that there's commonality about some of these very basic things, like how to treat another person. So those become more than just our agreement. That's the point there. It's not just, well, we agree in this room, Jürgen Habermas would have us get in a room like this and employ what he calls communicative ethics and come to agreement by reason alone. But Lewis would say, no, it's more than that. It's the experience of the world, and this is found everywhere we go in every culture, these kinds of things. So let's look at those things first and start there. But does that line up with Kant or no? What do you think Kant is saying about that? Would he go back to other experience at other times besides his own?
He seems to want to reject authority as
Yeah.
much as he possibly can.
As much as he possibly can is exactly right. Now, he does do the right thing because he's living under the rule of Frederick the Great. And so he does suggest that he is an enlightened leader. But the message of the essay is his reason is above that of Frederick the Great's.
Yeah, and so it depends very much on the person in power being a benevolent dictator, as it were. You know, if they're Joseph Stalin, it's a whole different idea.
Whole different idea, isn't it? Yeah. So the use of Frederick is interesting in this essay, but he has to kind of do that because his primary model is that he's a citizen of the state. That's his primary thinking model, that he's a citizen of the new emerging nation state. The idea of the nation state really emerges in this period of time, and he's a citizen of the state.
Is that something that emerged prior to him coming out with his works, or is his works part and parcel of that concept being
It's
formed?
part and parcel. Okay, our country is shaped by these ideas. Montesquieu, Locke wrote at the same time as Isaac Newton. So the second treatise on government is 1689. So the sources, the contemporary sources that Jefferson used and Madison used were these sources about how the emerging concept of a nation state should function. But they also went back and picked up a lot of Aristotle as well. So this little essay raises these questions. On the second page, I just suggest some things that are consistent with the Enlightenment model that comes out of this period of time, that have shaped modernity in a profound way. What we call postmodernity is actually the questioning of all of these assumptions. Whatever that means to anybody at any given time, and the meaning changes almost with every writer, it is a questioning of these kinds of assumptions here.
Could you explain a little bit more about nature as her own explanation?
That everything's within the box of physical nature, that nature explains herself. So we want to know one thing about one aspect of nature, we go to another part of nature, but nothing outside the box.
So the closed universe
It's
model.
a closed universe. It's a closed universe. And those are underlying assumptions in this work when he gets to the concept of reason. He doesn't spell it all out here. It's in other works that he spells those assumptions out more fully. But this was written for a popular audience to answer this question. At the heart of this is that concept of left free to make use of his own reason in all matters of conscience. We must be absolutely free. I guess the question we have to ask ourselves in the 21st century as we close up the last 2 minutes, and this is the question to which Lewis is going to be in part responding to when he's given the question at the Socratic Club, is theology poetry? And we'll do that this afternoon at 3:30, is just how well is this pursuit of freedom, absolute freedom, worked out for us? How are we doing with this process? How does the last 300 years look like to us? Some goods and some bads in here, and some struggles.
You mentioned that Kant mentioned conscience. Did he ever explain where conscience originates?
Yes, in the grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, he says it's rooted in that a priori reason that is before any sense experience at all. That in reason alone is where conscience is found, because that's where the categorical imperative can be shaped. That I should treat, well, he has two forms of it. The first form is that I should act in such a way that my actions become a law, a maxim for everybody else. So if I want to drive 95 miles an hour on the freeway, then everybody else ought to be able to drive 95 miles an hour on the freeway. And the other version of the categorical imperative is that I always treat the other person as an end in themselves and never a means to some other end. And he says everything's reducible to those two. And both of those are expressing the same maxim or the same idea, and that's what he arrives at it. He argues on the basis of reason alone, not sense experience, not experience of history, just solitary reason alone. And that's where conscience would come from.
So conscience to him is completely self-contained.
Yes.
Interesting.
Even though
Go ahead.
conscience is completely contained.
In our
Yes.
reason, in our minds.
What of the deformed conscience then?
You know, he
Or the conscience that never gets, reaches an age of maturity, uses language?
yeah, he doesn't deal with that.
Was he an only child? Because like the first maxim sounds just like German mothers I know. If I give you this cake, I have to give everyone else this cake.
Yeah.
There's your categorical imperative. The second one sounds a little bit more like, okay, that's original, like treat everyone not as a not means to not. And
Yeah.
but like some of the things that he says sounds to me a lot like, if you look, I mean, I don't want to psychologize him, but if you look at his upbringing, it's a little bit more telling than maybe 20 years ago when I first looked at Kant.
Well, he marked out very early as exceptionally bright, and so he was treated uniquely along the way. Yeah. He never married. He had no children. He lived alone all his life. He had lots of friends that came to visit him, but he never traveled anywhere outside of the little town of Königsberg. He
Wow.
taught logic and metaphysics at the university. That's how he lived his life. But he's one of the most important thinkers in world history and has shaped us profoundly, profoundly. So the questions he raises will get approached in a different way by Lewis this afternoon in his theology poetry. Well, thank you for joining in on this conversation and looking at this essay that's had shaping influence in our culture. And I invite you back this afternoon as we look at Lewis's essay. Thank you very much for being here.